So, hello everyone, thank you very much for coming. So my name is Christian Carl, I'm the editor of Democracy Lab, which is a joint venture between the Legatum Institute and Foreign Policy magazine, and we cover transitioning democracies, democratic transitions around the world. And because that's my subject, I've been asked to moderate the second panel. When I was asked to moderate this panel, I found myself thinking about a moment a few weeks ago when I was in Kigali in Rwanda, and I found myself having drinks in a very nice outdoor cafe with a general, one of the members of the ruling party of Rwanda, who was very upset with the flack they've been getting on human rights lately. As you probably know, Rwanda has a very tough autocratic regime, but they're also very good at on corruption issues, on some various governance issues. They're a darling of the international donor community. And this general really wanted to take me to task. He said, you know, you in the West have your own ideas of democracy. We have our own notions of democracy. You can't just tell us what to do. You can't go on criticizing us forever. But the really fascinating thing was that unlike perhaps a Chinese or Russian interlocutor in this situation, he was not my enemy and didn't see himself as such. He was quite proud of his country's record on a number of things. He wanted contact with the West. He wanted to see Rwandans educated in the West. He wanted Westerners in Rwanda. It was a very, very interesting, complicated mix of things. And I thought of him when I was asked to moderate this panel, which is in some ways the panel about tactics. The last panel was very much a panel about the big picture, about vision, about strategy. In this panel, we'd like to talk about how you get it done. So, for example, when I was talking to my Rwandan general, I found myself wondering, how do you go about promoting democratization in a country like that? Do you try to cultivate civil society? Do you educate, do you train lawyers? Do you promote free media? Or do you actually just forget about those things and concentrate on economic development and hope that at some point you'll reach the magic threshold when you have a middle class and they will take care of it? It's those sort of questions that we'd like to focus on in this panel. And for that reason, I don't want to talk anymore. I'd rather give the floor to the experts. And so I think the best thing for me to do is to hand it over to the esteemed Sarah Bush, who will talk about these issues. So thank you very much. Let's have a big welcome for her and the other members of the panel.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this exciting conference. It's an honor to be discussing these issues with an esteemed group of panelists and with all of you. So as our moderator already noted, in this panel, in contrast to the previous one, which was focusing on questions like whether the United States should promote democracy, I'm going to be focusing my remarks, along with those sitting beside me, on the topic of how the United States should promote democracy. And I think this nuts and bolts question of how the United States should promote democracy is vitally important, although it's one that has often been, I think, overlooked in the debates that we've been having about democracy promotion in the big picture over the last decade or so. But I do think that the devil is in the details when it comes to democracy promotion, as it does with so many things. If we're not promoting democracy effectively, or if we can't promote democracy effectively, then we probably need to reassess whether we should promote democracy at all. And on the flip side, if democracy promotion works, then I think it's really hard to argue that it shouldn't be part of the foreign policy picture. So I'm going to try to focus my remarks on the question of what we've learned about how to promote democracy after 3 decades. And I'm approaching this question from my perspective as a university professor and as someone who follows the large and growing body of research on the topic. And I'm grateful that other people who are on the panel with me can speak from their rich personal experiences working in this field. So from where I stand, the perspective from the research on democracy assistance's effectiveness is mixed. So I'll start with what I think is the good news. So from what I see, American democracy assistance works on average at aiding countries to democratize. About 10 years ago, USAID funded an academic study conducted by highly respected and independent scholars led by Stephen Finkel from the University of Pittsburgh to investigate the subject of USAID's program's effectiveness. And they found, both in the report that they were commissioned to write, as well as in a peer-reviewed study that was published by a journal based at Princeton University, that on average, USAID democracy and governance programs do have a causal impact, a positive causal impact on democracy. But they also noticed a lot of challenges to identifying this kind of effect. So one of the challenges they noted is that the countries that get targeted to receive democracy aid are not selected at random, and they tend not to be like the countries that don't receive aid. And so that makes it really hard to make a good comparison to gauge the effectiveness of the programs. They also noted that it can be hard to agree on how to define and measure democracy. And although we have a number of indicators from Freedom House and from the Polity Project, among others, that do give us excellent measures of democracy, we worry that these indicators may be at such a high level of aggregation that it's difficult to assess the impact of programs in the fine-grained kind of way that we need to do to know under what conditions they're effective. Another problem that was noted by this study is that some of our historical records on U.S. democracy and governance programs are poor. Okay, so there are a lot of challenges to identifying their impact, but no matter how the scholars sliced and diced the data, they found a good, strong, positive relationship between democracy aid and democratization. And I think the news gets better because it wasn't just this group of people that found this kind of relationship. Numerous other independent scholars have replicated the findings, people like James Scott and Carrie Steele, Burku Savun and Daniel Tirone. And not only do they find that democracy aid seems to be positively associated with democratization, but they find that democracy aid seems to help countries that are emerging from civil conflict maintain a fragile peace by reducing political uncertainty. And I think this speaks to some of the debates from the previous panel about fragility and uncertainty. But although there's all of this good news, there's also some bad news. From where I sit, although the studies seem to demonstrate that democracy promotion works on average, I think we don't have a fully compelling understanding of why it works and under what conditions it works. And that's pretty tricky. Without that knowledge, it's hard to figure out how to avoid some of the headline-grabbing worst-case scenarios of the past, and it's hard to know how to design programs better in the future. I wanted to offer some tentative ideas here about the conditions under which democracy promotion seems most likely to succeed, and I'm sure others on the panel, or maybe some of you, can and will disagree with me, which is fine. But I'd like to propose what I would call the 3 Ds of democracy assistance effectiveness. And the first D is donor interests. This is already something that we've talked about in the previous panel, that donors' interests matter a lot for democracy aid. One of the emerging consensus findings is that conditionality, by which I mean the linking of punishments and rewards to demands for improved democratic conduct, it can really work. An excellent recent book has been published by a woman named Daniela Dano on the subject of democracy promotion in elections. And here I'm quoting from her and saying that she found that it's rare that normative shaming or criticism alone can influence a leader with a track record of electoral misconduct. Likewise, aid alone is often insufficient. Instead, countries democratize when the United States and other Western countries bring out the carrots and sticks. And so I think although this is an obvious point, it is worth repeating here that democracy promotion activities face a much more uphill battle in the countries where the United States doesn't genuinely want democracy. And from my point of view, it makes sense for U.S. government agencies to concentrate scarce time and money and other resources in the countries where the U.S. is willing to back up democracy assistance with other tools of pressure, be they conditionality or diplomacy. Otherwise, I worry that democracy promotion can end up playing into the hands of undemocratic leaders, the very people who you'd want it to be challenging. My second D for democracy assistance effectiveness is delivery. To have a shot at supporting democratic change in countries where the United States has competing interests, initiatives that have insulation from the US government, like the National Endowment for Democracy, have to be an essential part of the formula. Although, and I'm sure many people in the room have experience with this, that American NGOs that receive government funding to work on democracy in the developing world, although they may have some suspicions that they have to face, I think is really important from the perspective of delivery to use strategies that are insulated in this way from the US government, because doing so prevents competing foreign policy objectives from overwhelming the program's good intentions of promoting democracy. Funding democracy outside of the US government is often the best strategy because doing so ties the US government's hands and prevents it from interfering in programming decisions. Otherwise, and here I return to my first D of donors' interests, it's too easy for donors' interests to swamp democratizing good intentions. I think there are a couple of other aspects of delivery, my second D, that are important for democracy assistance's efficacy, and I'll just mention one here, although we could go on. In my own research, one of the things I've looked at is how difficult it can be for donors to keep track of results overseas, and how sometimes this can lead organizations to focus a lot of energy on programs that seem likely to produce quick, quantitative outputs and outcomes, which may not be the same programs that are most likely to democratize countries. I think it's important for democracy aid to be delivered in ways that can help donors monitor success overseas so that they don't end up having to encourage organizations in what a former speaker has termed the democracy bureaucracy to teach to the test instead of innovate. And my fellow panelist, Melinda Herring, has written, I think, persuasively about the important role that competition can play in helping officials keep track of results overseas. And I hope that's something she'll pick up in her remarks. My third D is design. One of the most consistent problems that I've seen bedevil democracy assistance in the Middle East, which is a region I'm interested in, as well as in other regions of the world, is that sometimes the US government, whether for conditions at home or conditions in the country where the programs are taking place, US government is simply not in a position to directly support activities that are genuinely likely to promote democracy. Many of the US government efforts that I've seen in the region are quite tame. They're not very confrontational towards the status quo. They may take on issues like promoting women's inclusion or local governance in a fundamentally undemocratic environment. And I think that these types of programs may be good and right. In my own research, actually, in Jordan, I find that these programs can have very positive effects. However, I think that these kinds of programs are more questionably democratizing. And although it may be the case that they plant the seeds for democratic change in the future, I think the jury is still out on whether or not that's the case. And so, in my view, democracy assistance seems most poised to have a positive effect in countries with genuine opposition movements. So to wrap up my comments here, because I think I'm running out of time, you can view the core components of U.S. democracy promotion from a glass half full or glass half empty perspective, and I'm going with glass half full for today, at least. And I think one of the things that makes me optimistic about the future of U.S. democracy promotion is the recent push towards aid transparency. There are a number of initiatives in this realm. One of them that I'll highlight is a recent USAID-funded initiative, Aid Data, which is gathering and geocoding micro-level data on U.S. government aid projects. And Aid Data, along with other initiatives, is leading new detailed case studies of democracy assistance and foreign assistance, many of which are modeled on the research of the award-winning economist Esther Duflo, who has conducted randomized controlled trials out of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And I think this movement towards looking at the micro level trying to have more transparency in the allocation and design of foreign aid, and really looking at the details of how programs work on the ground overseas. Of course, it's not a panacea for any of the political problems identified in the previous panel. However, if democracy promotion is here to stay, and I imagine that it is, I think this kind of detailed knowledge is just what we need to understand the questions of why and under what conditions aid will work. And until we're finished looking through these detailed case studies, I will leave you with my own speculation about the 3 Ds: donor interests, delivery, and design.
Thanks very much for that, Sarah. So let's go over to Tsveta for her remarks.
Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I think I'm one of the few relative optimists in this room, and so for that reason, again, I'm especially grateful to be here, since sometimes it feels that there are fewer optimists left nowadays than I guess there were some time ago. My own work is on the democracy promotion efforts of the Central and Eastern European countries, members of the European Union. So those would be Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic countries. And this work has provided me with an unintended, but I still think valuable and unique perspective on the effectiveness of U.S. democracy assistance. So what I would like to do in my presentation today is give you a quick sense of how the Central and Eastern Europeans are promoting democracy and what that teaches us about the effectiveness of U.S. assistance. And then I'll move on to briefly reflect on the effectiveness of the Central and Eastern Europeans themselves, and then what are the potential cooperation opportunities I see between Central and Eastern Europe and the US in the field of democracy promotion. Now, what I've learned about Central and Eastern European democracy promotion is that in some countries it started almost immediately after their own democratic breakthrough. And it was championed by some of the same people who organized those domestic breakthroughs. So given the nature of regime change in Central and Eastern Europe, civil society has played an important and driving role in terms of democracy promotion, both as implementers of such support abroad, as well as champions and advocates for their states to invest similarly in supporting democratization abroad. The Central and Eastern European countries have leveraged their bilateral diplomatic channels, as well as various citizen diplomacy forums, to support democratization abroad, and they've also leveraged their membership in the EU and NATO. Lastly, a number of the Central and Eastern European countries have started providing democracy assistance, but it's tended to be more on the technical than the financial side. So in sum, we have several of these countries that have began supporting democracy primarily in their neighborhood. And they have emphasized diplomacy and especially regional multilateral diplomacy. And their efforts have tended to be limited in terms of the number of recipients and the geographic scope of recipients to a few neighboring countries. And those are points I'll come back to later in my presentation. So at this point, you may wonder what, if any, role the US has played in encouraging and supporting Central and Eastern European democracy promotion. And I've seen 2 types of impact. The first one is that in a number of the conversations that I had with key civic activists and foreign policy makers in Central and Eastern Europe, I kept hearing a common refrain, which is, to use a quote from one of my interviews, we have a debt to be repaid. So most of the people I talked to express a belief that they should themselves support democracy abroad because they received such support from a number of countries in the West, and especially from the US. So what that says to me is that US democracy promotion in Central and Eastern Europe has mattered. It has mattered because some of its recipients are still active domestically. Those were some of the key NGOs working in Central and Eastern Europe. And secondly, US democracy assistance and promotion more broadly has also mattered because it has had multiplier effects. Some of the direct recipients of US assistance in Central and Eastern Europe are now providing their own assistance further east and southeast. A second way in which I've seen U.S. democracy promotion matter is in the specific activities that are undertaken by the Central and Eastern Europeans. They have a fairly political approach to supporting democracy abroad, and by that I mean that they seek to, oftentimes and in general, seek to build a reservoir of pro-democratic actors in recipient state institutions and recipient civil societies who would push their country in a more democratic direction at opportune moments. In other words, the Central and Eastern European approach is very much like the US approach, except with less emphasis on elections. So, to the extent that the US has, again, similarly sought to build and empower political actors in Central and Eastern Europe, and we have a number of practitioners and academics arguing that it has indeed done that, we've seen that it has succeeded, because the Central and Eastern Europeans, who were themselves empowered by the US in part, and who are now seeking to share some of the best practices of their own democratization experience, including best practices that were developed by the US. In fact, again, thinking to the conversations I had with a number of those individuals, they oftentimes shared that it was external and, again, primarily US support that helped develop a whole sector of political actors in Central and Eastern Europe. Those are actors that would have probably been underdeveloped or missing because of the nature of their work and its opposition to powerful domestic political and economic actors. So again, stepping back, what that tells me is that U.S. democracy promotion has mattered, but also the specific activities through which it has been implemented has also mattered, because it has produced enduring domestic actors. It has empowered enduring domestic actors. The caveat here is that some of those actors are still struggling to survive. They have, with the withdrawal of U.S. support, have become somewhat dependent on EU funding, but nonetheless, they're active and they're an important part of the domestic debates in those countries, which again, I think is a positive sign. So at this point, I want to pause just a little bit and say that I trust these findings primarily because I did not ask the Central and Eastern Europeans about the U.S. role in supporting democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, and thus I did not give them an opportunity to give me a line that's rehearsed to please U.S. donors. It's evidence that I collected indirectly and that came up in conversations about Central and Eastern European democracy promotion. And again, my conclusions are not to dispute or wave away problems with U.S. democracy promotion or its unintended negative consequences, but just to highlight that it can and has mattered, and that it's an investment whose payoffs go up and down in the short and long term, etc., as we saw in the first panel, but it's an important investment. Now, in conclusion, allow me to return to the merits and limitations of the Central and Eastern Europeans as democracy promoters. Again, to discover those, I talked to their recipients in their neighborhood. Those recipients highlighted three important merits. The first one is the first-hand experience with democratization that the Central and Eastern Europeans have. As I said, a lot of the individuals involved in this work were themselves the organizers of the domestic breakthroughs. And so they have this unique experience with democratization, as well as moral authority in the eyes of their recipients. And they come with what I call recipes, or those are sets of steps that could be taken to implement certain reforms that could be, again, sets of steps to be taken that could be tailored to the needs of recipients, given the recipient's stage of democratization. The second important merit of those actors is their local knowledge and their ties to important local interlocutors, which give the Central Eastern Europeans access to important democratization stakeholders and allow them to broach sensitive issues as peers, rather than from, the pulpit of accomplishments and centuries of democratic experience. And the last merit that was very important to recipients was was the sustainability of Central and Eastern European efforts. As I said, a number of those countries have been active in the same set of recipients for more than 2 decades. And so, however small their efforts might have been, their impact has accumulated over time to produce some effects. Now, before...
Very sorry, Tsvetan, but you're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay. So the limitations. I think the most important limitation that those democracy promoters have had is their limited capacity. The second most important limitation is that their democracy promotion efforts have had a certain geopolitical or political component, which has sometimes undermined their consistency and impartiality. With that said, I believe they've helped make some democratization gains through the wave of electoral revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe. To me, what that means is that they have helped open windows of democratization opportunity, but unfortunately their efforts have not been enough to ensure or help contribute towards a sustainable long-term impact. So I'll conclude here, and in sort of the second round of comments, I will return to talk about the opportunities I see for cooperation between the US and some of the new democracies that have developed around the globe in the last 2 decades.
Great. Thanks very much. So, Michal.
All right. Thank you very much. And first of all, many thanks to Ambassador Basora for organizing this and for kindly inviting me here. It's a great honor, of course. I was asked to say a few words about Central Europe and the United States when it comes to democracy, and perhaps offers a kind of a Central European view on that issue. And I'm afraid I will differ a bit from what Tsveta just said. Not in the analysis, with which I fully agree, but my starting point is that Central Europe has been changing lately in the couple of past years. To say the maybe obvious, the United States were the first and most natural point of reference for anyone striving for freedom under the communist rule in Central Eastern Europe, and Americans were among the first to come to assist with the transition after 1989. Even though in terms of quantity, the US funding was quickly and by far exceeded by the European Union means for transformation assistance, the US political leadership and commitment greatly contributed to driving necessary transformation processes. As a result, many even felt that kind of a special kinship have developed between the two sides over the years. After President Barack Obama took office, however, as we all know, certain bitterness appeared. Several prominent political figures from Central and Eastern Europe responded in an alarming mode to the changes that the new administration introduced. To calm things down, the US articulated what we can call a new approach to Central European democracies. In October 2009, Vice President Joe Biden turned to us in Bucharest saying, "You've delivered on the promise of your revolution. You are now in a position to help others to do the same. Exercise your leadership." As we've just heard, I think that the Central Europeans mostly accepted the challenge and started working on that. And however, what we could see that on the one hand, we could see the European Union struggling with its own normative power in the past few years. And on the other hand, we could see that there was despite what we've heard in the morning, there was a lack of political commitment of the United States towards the region of Eastern Europe since 2009. And as a result, the entire region became more susceptible to voices and forces that do not wish democracy well. We've heard about the disturbing political development in Hungary. But also look at the new Czech government, that might be a surprise for anyone in the future weeks to come. The new Czech government works on changing its support of transformation in a way that might undermine the very concept of helping democracy to gain ground in authoritarian regimes. For example, the redrafted concept of the Czech transformation policy will likely include a provision that any future assistance will be based on a consent of the official government, that it will seek to support moderate protagonists of the status quo regime, and from what I know, all references to the term democracy are likely to be removed. There are populist xenophobes and extreme nationalists in Slovakia advancing into local and regional governments, and Poland, despite its current stable and high standing in Europe, systematically lacks a plausible political opposition, which is never good for a democracy. I could go on and on with this, but I won't. So what I want to say is we're facing a very treacherous mix, and it was confirmed by many speakers here today. The US, as the symbol of democracy in the eyes of the Central Europeans, seem unwilling or unable to provide a political co-leadership. The European Union is fully preoccupied with its own economic and governance problems, and Central European countries grapple with their rising post-transitional difficulties. The West increasingly doubts that ideals of democracy can penetrate hearts and minds of people universally. Alternative illiberal or undemocratic ideologies have been gaining ground around the world and in Europe. At the same time, and I find this quite bizarre, we never really left the comforting view that liberal democracy does not have any serious contender at the global market of ideologies. As a consequence of these trends, democracy promotions became progressively limited to technical and essentially non-sensitive, that is, non-political projects. These projects aid enormously to bolster civil society, NGOs, and institutional capacities, and so on. But because they are non-political by definitions, these projects cannot address the crucial issue, and that is the lack of democratic mode of thinking at the level of politics. Working democracy requires, first of all, a democratic mindset of practicing and aspiring politicians, and we do not address this issue. Therefore, any solution to these challenges must be a political one. But the very first step towards democracy revitalization must include thinking hard and sincerely of why is liberal democracy losing its attractiveness in the West. And by thinking hard, I do not actually mean the expert thinking. I challenge the politicians to do the thinking, because we kind of agree here, but we need to make this issue political. We have to start at home. Even though I agree with Mr. Thomas Melia from the State Department that the US is a leader in democratization in third countries, I would like to challenge this view that we now have to see more engagement within the family of democratic countries, because that's where I think we are losing confidence. We have to find a joint way to multinational, comprehensive, and political dialogue on democracy. And I'm afraid that this cannot take place without a firm commitment and co-leadership of the United States. And it's here where I see that the Central European region can contribute. Despite the murky view that I offered just moments ago, there are still fascinating elements of idealism in Central Europe. But this an idealism which has a very realistic and immediate understanding of what is at stake right now. Just where is this idealism coming from? Every one of us know, but there were times where, for example, the West largely accepted the vision of Europe for the sake of European security and stability, and this was time where the Central Europeans had nothing but idealism left, and people like Jiří Dinsbier and others tirelessly argued that stability based on this principle only aids to the forceful kidnapping of Central Europe. And now Europe is undivided, and no major war, no chaos, no instability occurred, so they were probably right in their assessment. So there are still plenty of people who are sensitive to trading democracy for perceived material gains. Maybe one surprising element of Central European society that might be worth of engaging is a dialogue with small and medium enterprises owners. These are people whose fate is most linked with a thriving liberal democracy. These are people who are most endangered by strengthening the state and by making open society not so much open anymore. To conclude, we've heard many excellent suggestions regarding new approaches and instruments for democratization this morning, and I'm very happy that I was able to be here. My contribution to this is instruments might work only if we are confident about our principal goals, and I do not see this confidence lately. We tend somehow to see the 1990s as an illusion, while we see current developments as reality. At the same time, Dreams of free and undivided Europe were being labeled illusions in the 1980s, and they became reality in the 1990s. My pragmatic American philosophy of science leads me to believe that in human affairs there is nothing like an illusion or reality. Therefore, I am more afraid about the lack of beliefs and confidence than of excessive illusions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, Melinda, over to you.
I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to be here this morning and delighted that we're having a serious conversation about reforming U.S. democracy assistance in Washington. I think it's high time. Like many others, my commitment to this field was inspired by the legacy of individuals like Havel and Walesa. When I became a program officer a few years ago, I desperately tried to understand the logic behind my $3.5 million program. It was a civil society program in Azerbaijan, and the program was meant to empower youth and women, and these are two powerless constituencies in Azerbaijan. The thinking was that if we were to empower these youth and women, they might convince their friends to pick up trash and start computer centers. Sounds good, but hardly the stuff of great change. We would have been far better off by putting those funds into investigative journalism in Azerbaijan. Courageous journalists in Azerbaijan have shown that there's a serious problem with elite corruption, and President Ilham Aliyev's 12-year-old son at the time owns 9 waterfront mansions in Dubai that are worth approximately $44 million. These are the kinds of stories that will break the fear factor and inspire people to change their own societies. I am very critical of the democracy bureaucracy, especially USAID, for implementing ineffective, cookie-cutter programs, but let me be clear. Democracy promotion is too important an instrument of U.S. foreign policy to do badly. There are many programs we could discontinue today and nothing would change. We can do better. So today, I'd like to offer 3 recommendations, and I'm not claiming that these are perfect solutions. I want to start the conversation about how to reform U.S. assistance. I'd like to make a point on structure, strategy, and transparency. And I'm going to start with structure. Like Sarah said, not many scholars focus on the actual delivery of U.S. assistance, but it's very crucial. There are 2 main institutional models for delivering assistance in the United States. We have a field-based model and a independent grant-making model. The field-based model is primarily headquartered, it has a headquarters in Washington and it has field offices around the world. The independent grant-making model typically has a headquarters office, but it works primarily through grants and local partners. The U.S. government overwhelmingly distributes its democracy assistance dollars through the field-based model. And a couple of the names that are probably very familiar to everyone here are the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, Counterpart International. There's dozens of others. And they all operate roughly along the same kind of lines. They have a large office in Washington that sets the strategy, while field offices are scattered throughout the world in Cairo, Baku, everywhere else. And the programs are actually executed in those countries. But field offices have 2 main disadvantages, and I'd like to get us thinking about these and talking about this today. Number 1, field-based organizations are vulnerable to strong-arm tactics by repressive regimes. Look no further than Moscow and Baku. Almost everyone has been pushed out of Moscow and Baku that were operating with field-based organizations. Donor organizations without field offices are less vulnerable to pressure because they don't have local offices to shut down. The second obvious disadvantage I see is that the field-based model is really inefficient. Overhead costs, including salaries, rent, and expatriate perks in an organization with field offices, can reach up to 70%, while overhead at an independent grant-making organization like the National Endowment for Democracy is 16%, 70 versus 16. When pressed on why they need an in-country presence in not-free countries, organizations with field offices will argue that their presence will enable them to seize opportunities when there's greater political space. But if political change comes to a place like Uzbekistan, where Islam Karimov has ruled for over 2 decades without a whiff of democratization, having had a field office in Tashkent will make no difference. If anything, implementing programs with the permission of a clearly authoritarian leader only tarnishes an organization's credentials. If a democratic awakening occurs in a place like Uzbekistan, real reformers may refuse to work with an organization that had cooperated with the old regime. Having had relationships with civil society activists, not maintaining field offices puts organizations in the best position to take advantage of newly open space. Now, I want to give you some examples. So you know that, let me point to a couple of examples from Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. USAID spent $5.6 million from 2007 to 2011 to enhance the overall effectiveness of Azerbaijan's parliament. And I'm probably one of two Azerbaijan experts here, so I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you that the parliament has never been freely elected, and every member of parliament is a member of the ruling party. Yet U.S. taxpayers paid for an orientation program for these new parliamentarians, all of whom won elections that the U.S. Embassy in Baku described as not meeting international standards. It gets worse. The U.S. government rejected these elections, and then they trained the winners. USAID even paid for a new website to make this illegitimate parliament more efficient. This is not farce. This is all publicly available in USAID's reports. A final assessment carried out by two outside experts found that this parliamentary program, this $5.6 million program, did not change how the parliament functions or how ordinary people in Azerbaijan relate to and understand the parliament. Since Azerbaijan's independence in 1991, USAID has spent $55 million on programs to make the country more democratic. The country remains undemocratic and is in fact becoming more and more authoritarian. In spite of this obvious negative trajectory, the U.S. government presses on with multi-million-dollar programs in Azerbaijan. In 2012, USAID issued a $1.5 million call for, I want you to listen to this, it's in bureaucratic language, it's beautiful, that would enable key civil society organizations to better respond to President Aliyev's vision and calls for more meaningful and state civil society partnerships, fulfilling the government's commitments to various international human rights instruments, end quote. The idea of U.S. taxpayer dollars going to implement the supposed democratic vision of Azerbaijan's authoritarian president reinforces the notion that foreign aid is a scam. I'll give you an example from Kazakhstan. This is a typical program. You'll see this in every part of the world. I'm a Eurasia specialist, so my examples are from the Eurasia region. USAID worked with a contractor. It was a $1.75 million program to increase the capacities of Kazakhstan's leading civil society organizations. Well, there's a problem here. That presumes that Kazakhstan, so we were going to pump up the capacity of civil society organizations so that they could better represent the interests and reflect those to the government. The problem is that Kazakhstan has a parliament that does not derive its legitimacy from constituents, and they actively manipulate the elections. So the program makes absolutely no sense. Why does USAID continue to fund these misguided programs in authoritarian countries with no interest in reform? It's simple: bureaucratic self-interest and the assumption that more is always better. We can end this waste with an emphasis on triage, allocating more money where there's a greater chance of change. The alternative model is the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's a well-known model. It does things very differently. It funds small grants directly around the world, and it selects the most promising ideas from indigenous organizations. So Russians are trying to fix Russian society. There's a lot of wisdom in this model. It acknowledges, like Tom Melia said, that outsiders have a limited role to play in political transitions. In my opinion, the NED is an absolutely unique model and one that should be commended and bolstered. Practically speaking, the rule that I've come up with when thinking about a division of labor, as Carl encouraged us to do, is that only the NED should operate in countries that Freedom House ranks as not free, while USAID and its implementers should concentrate their skill and know-how in partly free environments.
Okay,
My-
we're going to have to get to the conclusion.
Sure. My two other points, I'm just going to summarize them, are on strategy. And on strategy, we ought to deploy our shrinking resources in places where a democratic outcome is likely. So that means no multi-million-dollar programs in Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, or Uzbekistan. These countries are not in transition, and we shouldn't fool ourselves thinking that they are. My final point is on competition. Competition needs to be encouraged, and transparency is a vital aspect of competition. There's some non-competitive mechanisms in this field, and those need to be eased out. So, in conclusion, I think the democracy assistance community needs to have a tough conversation about the meaningfulness of its programs. As a program officer, I was appalled when I went through old files and saw that we'd been implementing the same tired strategies for more than 10 years. This needs to change. Taxpayers deserve better, as do aspiring Democrats. Thank you.
So thanks very much. Let's have a round of applause, first of all, for our panelists. They did hard work up here. And now I would like to ask you all to very quickly sum up your conclusions from what we said so far. You each have 3 minutes, which is not very much, but let's keep it crisp. Thank you.
Okay, I'm actually not really sure where to begin. There is a lot of interesting things that were just said. So I guess I would just pick up on a few points that the other panelists made that really resonated with me. And as I'm not a Eurasia specialist, I'm learning a lot from them. So I think one point that I'd like to hit on is that I think some of the structural problems that Melinda identifies with the field-based model, I think occasionally some of the donors' interest concerns that I tried to emphasize in my presentation can be lurking in the background. I think that I have observed pretty similar legislative assistance programs, large legislative assistance programs in countries like Jordan, where there can be kind of magnificent attempts to build the parliament's capacity, even while the parliament is no longer exists because it's been dismissed by the monarchy. I think that they originate from some of the same dynamics that Melinda is talking about, but some of the geostrategic imperatives also are at play. So I guess I would just emphasize the continuing role of donors' interests, even as we look at some of the structural and kind of competitive aspects that were highlighted. And I think that in Sveta's comments about the idea that some actors have that there's a debt to be repaid and a really ardent commitment to promoting democracy, these are, I think, the donors that are willing to make the hard trade-offs against competing interests and financial pressures to promote democracy in ways that are most likely to make change. So I'm sure that's under, my time, but let me give it to my fellow panelists to finish their remarks.
So I'd like to return to this idea of reforming U.S. democracy promotion by encouraging its cooperation with actors, democracy promoters from other new democracies around the world. And again, I will speak from my experience in Central and Eastern Europe, but I think there are important complementarities. I believe that the U.S. reputation as one of the oldest democracies around the globe, but still a democratic innovator, as well as its capacity, are a good match for the first-hand experience with democratization, as well as the local knowledge and ties of a lot of those new democracies that are regional players. Some such cooperation has already begun, but I think there is room for improvement. So allow me to put forward 4 such ways in which I think this cooperation can be more fruitful, which in part respond to some of the criticism that we've seen about the democracy promotion efforts of new democracies. The first one is that a lot of U.S. engagement with those actors has been top-down, and it's mostly in the form that my colleague talked about of U.S. Diplomats putting pressure on those governments to do democracy work. I don't think that works, and Hungary is a great example here. There was a lot of investment, both from the US as well as Western Europe, in getting Hungary to support democracy in its neighborhood, and that did not work. Now we see that was perhaps for the better good of the neighborhood. But what I think is more important here is that what the US could do instead is invest in organic, bottom-up, civic cross-border solidarity and cooperation, and political party-level cross-border solidarity and cooperation, and local government cross-border solidarity and cooperation. That brings me to my second point, which is that I think part of the reason why we talk past each other is that we have different visions of what democracy promotion should be like. To me, democracy promotion is about solidarity among actors who are interested in making their countries more democratic ones. And oftentimes, that kind of solidarity is possible and especially important when both sides of the donor-recipient dyad are struggling with challenges to democracy at home. So the fact that Central and Eastern Europe is at the moment in perhaps a moment of disillusionment with democracy is not a reason to discourage their democracy promotion. In fact, I've seen some of the most successful efforts be exactly activists or politicians who are pro-democratic sitting together and brainstorming about what is it that they can learn from each other.
I'm terribly sorry,
Okay,
but
finishing up. And again, what I've seen from Central and Eastern democracy promotion is that oftentimes it is not just about what those countries have done at home, but what they have done that didn't work and maybe that their counterparts should not repeat abroad.
great. Thank you very much, Michal.
All right, thank
What's
you
your,
very-
what's your takeaway? What stands out for you?
Well, it would be kind of disparate, but one thing is that I definitely agree that there is a lot to be done with the Central European NGOs. As they are well equipped for their experience. They're relatively cheap to to run. They are not corrupt too much, so there's definitely a lot to use. But the problem is that there's a growing gap between those who would work for the NGOs and the frustrated society writ large, frustrated and apathetic. And I mean, there's a lot of losers of the economic transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, but there are those who are attempting to use this frustration and to change it into a better grip of a state over the society. One question maybe to Melinda, and I don't think you really that was the way you were heading, but there was something about kind of pulling back money from the most closed regimes. I completely agree with the logic, but how to make sure that, I mean, the societies are not monolithic, which you know much better than me. So how to make sure that those who are striving for democracy in those regimes, that these are alive, you know, or they have some money to distribute, whatever they have to distribute. So how to make sure that, is it through net, or how to make sure that this is going to happen? And one last remark, maybe coming back to the first panel, we did not address the fact that I mean, we use Poland or Central Europe as a reference point for good transitions, but we didn't say that this happened when pro-democracy promotion was the highest priority of both the European Union and the United States. I mean, there are some structural elements in the societies in the region and so on that might help it, but we should realize that this is not the case anymore. I mean, the democracy promotion is not that close to our hearts as it was in the 1990s. So we should not blame everything on the third countries or on the societies, but we somehow kind of scaled back our own ambitions.
So, Melinda, maybe you can respond to that a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm gonna do my takeaways, then I'll respond to Michal if that's all right. So on Sarah's points, I think she's right that conditionality is something that's really important, and this is a point that's made in the literature over and over again. That democracy promotion is much more difficult now because we have a lot less conditionality. Maybe we need to think more creatively about how to create new conditionality. Let's see. I hear you on delivery that there's a tendency to focus on programs that are results heavy, and so there's a tension because you want to give implementers enough room to be able. I mean, this is difficult work, and it often takes years and years. I think there is a tension in delivery, and I think you're absolutely right to point to that. Sveta, I'd love to hear you. I've heard Sveta speak before, and when she talks about local ties and knowledge, she makes a really important point. She didn't give the example today, but she observed a program. It was, I think, a USAID-funded program. It was a local governance program, and USAID was trying to take a local governance program to Ukraine, and it didn't fit at all in the context. And she said, it would have been much better served if we'd taken the Polish model, which is much more similar, and applied it in a Ukrainian context. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think Michael made some interesting points that programs tend to be very technical and not political. And Carl said that this morning, that the political part of this is extremely important, and we shouldn't shy away from that. And I also liked Michael's point on looking at small and medium-sized business owners. But to answer your question, I see a division of labor. I don't think we should cut off all assistance to even very hopeless countries. We should continue to use the National Endowment for Democracy to keep the flame alive. They know how to work in authoritarian regimes better than anyone else. And ambassadors also have small funds that they can give out as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Now, I wish we had a bit more time, but let's open it up for questions, please. This woman here, yes, in, I think, fifth row.
Miriam Lansky, National Endowment for Democracy. Melinda, thank you so much for bringing up Azerbaijan, which I think is a very timely and excellent case study for a lot of the themes that have come up here. First of all, for the pull of Europe, the argument about Central Europeans being such a great model is the idea that Europe is not only a model, but the idea of membership can promote better democracy in the applicant countries. Azerbaijan has carried out the worst crackdown ever. It has arrested dozens of activists. The best human rights people, the best journalists are in jail. And this has happened while Azerbaijan was the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Council of Europe. So it only works. Europe as a magnet, as a prize, can only work if Europe is true to its values. If it enforces.
Question?
So what do you think of that? Is it a counterexample? And for you, Melinda, also on Azerbaijan, with these people in jail, some of them have received funding from USAID and from European donors. Donors are already announcing new grant competitions. So with top people in jail, there's an opportunity for the government to bring up a whole bunch of gongos right now.
Yeah.
So what should USAID, what should European donors, NED, others do in a situation like this? All your best people are in jail. You have millions of dollars to spend. European Commission announced new $3 million competition. How should people handle it?
So, Melinda, I think that one's for you.
I think the second part's for me.
Okay.
Okay.
Why don't you tackle it?
Yeah, okay, I'll jump right in. I really share your concern, Miriam. I can't believe that many of the people I've worked with in Azerbaijan are behind bars. And I think Tom Melia was really clear on this point, that we need to use our political and moral leadership to stand up for these people. So democracy, and Carl made this point too, democracy assistance isn't just programs. It's also using our moral leadership to say that you can't get away with this, and holding states to the commitments that they've made. So I've seen that Azerbaijan and these donors have more money, and I've seen horrific programs, I think mostly aid-funded programs in Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan funding gongos. And I don't think that we should be funding gongos, and we need to do a better job of figuring out who's a gongo and who's not. And you can't quote someone like Islam Karimov and take him seriously as a democratic reformer, or Ilham Aliyev. So if there
For those of you who don't speak the language, a gongo is a fake NGO sponsored by an authoritarian government.
and there's plenty of them in the regime. So we need to do our due diligence before we give out money. I mean, that we have to do due diligence. But when there's no one to fund, put the money in countries where there's more openness, namely in this region, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia.
Very good. Miriam, does that cover it? I'm sorry, I think we'll just have to move along. Yes, this gentleman in the middle here.
Thanks, Ira Strauss. I'm head of something called the Democracy International, which is a legacy organization from the Cold War era democracy promotion. I have a question about the connection of this with the first panel. This has been wonderful on the specifics of democracy promotion efforts, but there's been a question about multiple standards, double standards, multiple considerations in life. Sveta said it's a weakness of Central European democracy promotion to have strategic purposes. I would say that's a strength. The first wave of democracy promotion had a clear strategic conception in the 80s, and legacy after the 80s when communism collapsed.
So the question, though.
And the question is, have we gone from doing more good than harm when we knew what we were about and when we answered to realist criticism seriously, we were controversial, have we gone to doing more harm than good because we forgot the constraints that could make us sometimes do more harm than good?
Who would like to tackle it? Sveta, would you?
Yeah.
Great.
I ran out of time, otherwise I would have elaborated on that point. And the way that I see the geostrategic angle play here is that it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, if there is a clear security rationale that backs democracy promotion, it makes a country provide efforts that are resolute, that are sustained, and that in that way have a positive impact. On the other side, however, such a geostrategic rationale oftentimes serve to make those efforts inconsistent because those countries are tempted to back the their guy rather than necessarily watch out for improving the democratic process. So to me, there is a trade-off there. And just as we discussed in the first panel, it's something that the country has to educate its public about, have a conversation, and decide where along the continuum it's willing to sit.
I actually have a question I'm going to ask very quickly, and it's a question from Michal, especially, perhaps also Sveta, whoever wishes to answer. So we talked about Hungary, but we sort of danced around it. Prime Minister Viktor Orban recently gave a speech where he said, we want a liberal democracy. We're tired of this liberal democracy stuff. So it would seem that Western democracy promotion efforts in Hungary have failed. Let's just say that. How did they fail? What did we do wrong? I realize the answer may be a long one, but let's try to boil it down.
Well, first of all, we should be also clear about when Viktor Orban was denouncing liberal democracy, what he was actually doing, he was denouncing democracy. He kind of took parts of liberalism here and there, but what he was attacking was the idea of democracy. And I think that the failure was basically the stuff of my presentation, but I would say one more thing that
But sum it up for us, one
Right.
sentence.
Well, sum it up.
He's an academic Christian.
Yeah.
There's too much.
Two sentences.
No, but I would say one more thing above the presentation. Piotr Vandic, famous Polish historian, said that history is like a pendulum in Central Europe. That we are always too much pro-Western and we look up to the West, and we are kind of hurt by never getting to those standards. So we try to denounce West, and this is a dynamics that is going on for ages, and I'm afraid that Hungary simply is getting the pendulum back now.
So it's not really our fault, it's just the dialectic.
Well, I think it is our fault because we thought that the pendulum is never going to go back, so we set everything on an autopilot. That was why I was criticizing the technical aspect of the transition assistance.
Got it. Sorry, I just had to ask that. How about the gentleman in the second row from the end there? Yes, thank you.
Hello. I'm a Reagan Fassel Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, and probably, I think, one of the only Africans in here. I come from Zimbabwe, where, the state has captured all institutions, as you know. But I see the international community, including the United States, supporting tame programs. I think you spoke about tame programs. And civil society being castigated for being too political. But we know that from research evidence that a dictatorship that has captured institutions will never reform.
Right.
But my question is on the role of the neighboring countries in aiding democracy, particularly South Africa, in the case of Zimbabwe. On the one hand, South Africa is supporting the victims of political persecution by taking them in. But on the other hand, it is aiding Robert Mugabe's regime. What do you think should be the role of the neighboring countries, particularly in the Southern African context, in promoting democracy within a country like Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Maybe Sarah, you want to tackle that? No?
Well, I can say a word. Maybe others will have something to say too. I mean, one of the things I take from Sveta's comments is that neighboring states have a lot to offer, but they don't always seize the opportunity. So without knowing so much about this specific case, I would say, it's a shame for neighboring states not to take the opportunity to play such a constructive role with better insight, perhaps, into local political dynamics. And one would assume a lot of economic and other forms of leverage. So, would you like to weigh in?
I think, again, I'm not a regional expert, but what I've seen is that regional actors have a very important role to play. And sometimes it takes encouragement to realize that potential. Sometimes that encouragement is by the people in the recipient country that are struggling for democracy, reaching out and asking both fellow civic activists as well as politicians, helping them articulate the rationale why democracy should be aided in their own country. At other times, it takes international actors, oftentimes through regional forums or powerful actors such as the US, to encourage such democracy promotion. So the fact that that's current South Africa's role is ambiguous in Zimbabwe, I would not take as a discouragement, but I would take as a challenge that could be resolved.
Very interesting. Yes, right here, please.
Following on the last question, does government funding lead to tame programs? Because government has other interests? And if so, do private sector groups and foundations, are they more likely to be aggressive, and can they pick up the bulk of democracy funding if government chooses not to do it? And then if the U.S. government is not actually promoting it, but it's private U.S. foundations, what's the impact in recipient countries? Does it help or hurt the cause of democracy promotion?
Great question. So who would like to take that?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll say a word. So yeah, that's what I think. I think that government programs face a lot of competing interests that make it difficult, at least in certain countries, to fund and design programs that would be most effective at supporting democratic change. And I think that private actors have a much greater scope to pursue those kinds of programs. So that's certainly my perspective. I mean, I would also add, however, that it's not just the government on our end of things that plays sometimes a difficult role and has competing interests. Is obviously also the governments in the countries where the programs are going to be taking place. And I think that's where the comment about the field-based versus grant-making model is also relevant, because for no matter how the program is being funded, the program, if it is based through a field-based office, may have certain pressures that will also kind of tame, as I would put it, the program. So I think that the delivery makes a huge difference, but it's not the only factor that I would highlight.
I'd say having a field office is a real thing. Country directors worry about especially in authoritarian and semi-authoritarian countries, they worry about their field staff, their security all the time. You get threatening phone calls, people are followed. I mean, this is a real thing in these kinds of countries. I have a slightly different answer than Sarah. This is a $3 billion industry. I can't see how you're going to raise $3 billion a year in private interests. And I would also worry about if the money is coming from, I presume, companies. I've looked at some corporate social responsibility programs, and companies have interests as well, and we would be naive if we didn't recognize that. And with corporate social responsibility programs, a lot of these are oil companies, or they're going to have interests that will probably produce the same kind of lame programs that we've identified.
The gentleman way back there in the white shirt, please.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. I would like to play a little devil's advocate here. Now, we all know that the Congress has a very low rating in this country, 15% or 14%, which is kind of a shame because actually democracy depends on Congress, not on a dictatorial president that we have here. Finally, we try to spread democracy throughout the world through violence, which is, I mean, somebody just mentioned that some dictators use savage violence. We use super savage violence, invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, invading Yemen. I mean, that does not bode very well for a country that claims that they're spreading democracy. And our own democracy is regressing too. I mean, just as many other countries.
I'm terribly sorry, but we got to get to the question.
Yeah, given that, what is the credibility? And most of our, also 99% of our NGO, including Wilson Center, are also Congo. You used the term. I'm glad you explained to me because I was not aware of that term. Given that, where are we going with all this?
Who would like to tackle that, maybe?
Well, maybe just a few words. I would take this criticism very seriously, and that's exactly what I meant when I said that we have to reflect politically on what's wrong with democracy and why these arguments are being presented at forums like these, because this is something that we have to take very seriously. I mean, to the question of violence, I think that Ambassador Basora was very clear, or who said that in the first panel, that that democracy through violence is not a way, and I think we discovered that. And I would even, I mean, we have to use that as a reference for what not to do, but I wouldn't use that as a reference for not making democracy help to flourish in different countries. But once again, I think that we really have to start at home. That was actually the whole point of my presentation, and to think hard about our own democracy and what are we ready to sacrifice for that, and so on and so on. So I actually thank you for your critical remark.
So I think we probably just have time for one more question. So this gentleman right in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Tabish. I'm a fellow at National Endowment for Democracy. I'm from Afghanistan. Actually, initially I was not interested to put the questions because the context was quite different, but looking to the recent questions, I'm interested to ask Melinda about her comments that she actually advocate for closing the cases of democracy assistance in the countries like Afghanistan. I was just wondering that if you're gonna support democracies in the countries where the grounds are paved and like a piece of cake, you're ready to go there, then why you're not interested to support the countries who are vitally supporting and advocating for democracy? Looking even to Afghanistan, actually, primarily it was a military approach. Recently, it changed to a civil approach. Closing the case of democracy in Afghanistan means that you are just wasting billions of dollars that you have supported on media, independent organizations, and civil society in Afghanistan. And it means that it is, let me to call it the way that we are calling in Afghanistan, it's a narrow-minded Pakistani narrative of Afghanistan. Afghans are not deserved to be democratized, so let them to do it through the Daesh and Taliban approach, which is totally not correct.
What's the question?
My question is that, how you gonna close the cases while there are many interested and many functioning civil society organizations and democracy activists in the field? Of course, looking to easy examples like Ukraine, which has open society, and Georgia as your own example, is quite a different history. But why not supporting the countries who needs the support? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for that question. So I I want to get back to this question of division of labor. That's what my remarks were primarily about. I'm not saying that the U.S. should not give any assistance to Afghanistan and to courageous Democrats there. To the contrary, I definitely think we should be. But I think that's a role for the National Endowment for Democracy and not for a multi-million-dollar program that has been highly ineffective. There's lots of examples I could point to, USAID-funded programs. I view these as sunk costs. And as Larry Diamond will probably say during lunch, you have to have a state in order to do these programs. You have to have a functioning state. And that's a key part of this. And we haven't talked very much about that, but I think most of us in this room probably would draw a large distinction between nation building and encouraging democratic transitions. And nation building is something entirely different. That's I'm not an expert on nation building, and I think it's extremely hard. It's extremely difficult, and you have to be fully committed to it. I think my comments are mostly directed at encouraging democratic transitions.
So as so often, the biggest question comes up at the end. Michal, you wanted to say something very quickly, and then
Yes.
we'll go to the next
Yeah,
part.
well, just one thing that. Okay.
Okay, well, let's talk about that among ourselves then. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to call Will Porrans back up here, and he can take my place and tell us what we're going to do next.
I want to begin by thanking this panel so much. We were asked several questions at the beginning of this conference about what is the future and what is the alternative in terms of democracy promotion. And I think we just learned a huge amount here in terms of how to approach this issue. And again, thank the panel. But now we're actually going to be able to move to lunch and hear what Larry Diamond himself has to say about some of these issues. What I ask everyone to do is just go across the hallway, grab your lunch, and then we'll keep going into the cafeteria, and hopefully we'll be able to begin lunch by 12:40. So again, thanks all the panel, all the participants from the first panel as well, and we move on to lunch.
Maybe it was a good idea to come here because, like.